I'm Regina Bublil, and I go by the name of Regina Waldman today because I married a Waldman. I was born and raised in Tripoli, Libya in 1948. And when I was born, there were some 36,000 Jews living in Libya, but by the time by 1967, there were only 6,000 Jews left. So I was born in a community that was very closely knit, Orthodox, very small community. However, everybody knew each other. We celebrated festivities and Jewish holidays together. Very traditional. My family was extremely conservative and traditional, especially in the way that women should be acting in the society. It wasn't, for example, we didn't learn Torah or learning Hebrew because it was so hard already to teach the male members of the community just to learn Hebrew. So only my brothers were actually trained in becoming bar mitzvahs and so forth. The Jewish community had no choice but to send their children to Catholic schools. Even it's ironic that an Orthodox Jewish community should send their children to Catholic school because we couldn't be accepted by the Arab schools, and also because by choice the Arab schools were very anti-Israel and anti-Jewish, so we didn't want to be indoctrinated in this sort of hate culture.
How many brothers and sisters do you have, and where do they live?
My family had 2 brothers and 1 sister and myself, so we're 4 siblings. We lived in Tripoli in the Italian section of town. There was somewhat an Arab Jewish section, which was the old area, and then a lot of the Jews started moving out into the Italian and European section of town. That's where we lived, in Tripoli. I lived across the street from the Italian elementary school where I went to school. And I had a very close friend of mine who was my Arab neighbor. She lived, she was 14, we were both 12 and 13 years old when we became very good friends. And one of the worst experiences I had was when she was given in marriage at the age of 13 to a much older man who was in his 40s. And I begged her mother not to give her away in marriage. And the mother said that that was Fatima's maktub, which is her destiny.
Do you have any memories or anecdotes of your grandparents, where they were born, where they lived, what kind of activities they had, where they passed away?
My grandfather was a developer, a builder. My grandmother was a house wife, but she also had healing powers, and a lot of the neighbors would come to her to, quote unquote, take out the evil eye. So she was using all kinds of herbal methods to heal people. She also had a very popular kind of personality. She had a group of friends and followers that would come to her, and she would somehow have either healed them or chased the evil eye from them by doing these tricks with handkerchiefs and prayers and so forth. And I grew up with that environment. She also was a very well-known famous cook, and some of the recipes that I've learned are from my grandmother. I was named after her, actually.
What is your father's name? Where was he born?
He was, my father was born Regina Bublil. He took over and became a partner of my grandfather's firm, which was also in the construction business. And he also owned a warehouse where he bought oil equipment and tents and everything to do with digging for oil in the desert. And he was actually traveling quite a bit at the time when I grew up. I remember that he was traveling as I was a little girl, and he would be going to Holland and Germany and places like this to purchase merchandise.
Was he an observant Jew, or was he secular?
My father was the only member of the family who was not observant. He was traditionally Jewish, but not really Orthodox.
Was he educated? Did he go to university?
My father actually did not have much of an education. He didn't want to go to school, and in those days my grandfather didn't really encourage him to do much, which was a shame because he turned out that my father had a brilliant mind for math and science and business. Actually, he became a very successful businessman, but he was pretty much built his own career.
What is your mother's name?
My mother was born Laura Rabba. She became an orphan from her father's passed away when she was only 9 years old, and her mother, who had to take care of 4 children, didn't have enough money to take care of the family. So my grandmother, somehow Rabba, my mother's name was Laura Rabba, gave Laura to her own sister to bring her up because she didn't have enough money to feed the family. But then, as a result, my father and my mother, who are first cousins, were fixed in marriage, and it was not a love marriage. In fact, my mother became somewhat resentful of this, but later on I think she reconciled with the idea, but she never could forgive her own mother somehow for giving her away only because they didn't have enough money to keep her in the house.
How old were your parents when they got married?
My mother was only 17 years old. She had me when I was 18 years old. And my father was about, I would say about 10 or 12 years older than my mom.
What did your mother do? What were her activities inside of the home and outside of the home?
She did a lot of cooking and cleaning, and she was actually, she was a very good looking woman. She had a couple of men that were pursuing her or courting her, and she talks about that. But of course, once she was snatched off by my father, there was nothing she could say about it. She couldn't rebel. She couldn't. She tells a very sad story that I actually have written about her own maktub, which is her own destiny, and how her mother kept saying, "Well, my dear, this was my maktub that you should marry your cousin." It was already preordained. And a lot of the customs that were taken up by the Jewish community there are very much similar to some of the customs from the Muslim community, such as the destin and the maktub and the hamsa. So my mom didn't think that she had any choice, or she couldn't speak out for herself, and so she resigned herself and married my father, and she had the 4 children. But then it was not until I became very much of an adult and had my own children that my mother actually told us the story. We didn't know about it. My mother was very much into like housewife in every sense. I mean, by the time she took care of the 4 kids, and she had a lot of responsibilities to run the house and so forth.
What are your memories of the Italian quarter of Tripoli?
Some were sad and some were good memories. We lived in a neighborhood that was somewhat modern by the standard at the time. We're talking about, 1950s, 1960s. I went to my first Italian school when I was 6 years old, and I encountered, actually surprising for me, I recognized there was anti-Semitism amongst the Arabs, but I didn't realize there was so much anti-Semitism in a Catholic school. I didn't know. I felt much safer there at first, but then I realized that the teacher, for example, made many anti-Semitic remarks. I was only 6 and 7 years old, and my parents were Orthodox, so they didn't want me to go to school on Saturday because it was Shabbat. But the teacher made it clear that if I didn't come, she would flunk me. I was first grade, So she actually did. My first grade of, in a school where I didn't speak the language, I only spoke Arabic. I had to learn Italian. I was flunked only because I didn't show up on Saturday, knowing that my family was Orthodox. But then after that, when I went to the secondary school, I encountered anti-Semitism amongst the students. They would make fun of me and say, oh, you are waiting for the Messiah. The priest told us that if you don't believe in Jesus, we go to hell, and you killed Jesus Christ and such stuff. So at that time, if you compared it to the anti-Semitism going on and hatred culture with the Arabs, it almost sounded like maybe it wasn't so bad. It was almost like a way to rationalize and deny the fact that we were not really welcome in that country. So that's the only way that we could survive, is by having that denial. So when I grew up to be 14 years old, I decided that I wanted to go to school in Switzerland, and my parents didn't want to hear anything like that, because that was unheard of, a girl 14 years old going to Switzerland. But I persisted, and I actually went on a hunger strike for 5 days and convinced my parents that that was the way to go. So finally, when they let me go and I arrived in Switzerland, the border police checked my travel document, and we're not allowed to have a passport. We're only allowed to have a travel document that allows us to leave the country for a few months. So they wouldn't let us into the country. They wouldn't let me into the country. But eventually, I realized that I had to speak up for myself. So I ran to the police officer, and I didn't speak any French at the time or English. So I ran over to him and I said, "Me no passport because me Jewish." So it's at that time that he stamped my travel document and said, "Ben-Gurion, Swiss, welcome to Switzerland." It was a turning point for me as a 14-year-old, very impressionable young person, because this actually became my first act of true activism, to speak out for myself or for my rights. And that's was a cornerstone, because it established the career that I chose afterwards, which was to fight for human rights and speak out for other people. So
to go back to Libya, what languages did you speak at home with your family?
I grew up speaking Arabic, and then Italian came when I was 6 years old. So when I am with my family, or when we're speaking together, I usually mix the two. Typically, to this day, I still speak Arabic to my mom. And of course, because she lives in Italy now, that a lot of Italian is mixed into the language. We did not really belong to Jewish organizations per se, because there weren't none. By the time I was born, I think there was like a club, Maccabi club of some sort, that served as a center, and that was closed down. In 1967, the war broke out in Israel and its Arab neighbors, and what happened was it was pretty much open season on the Jews of Tripoli, not because we supported the quote-unquote enemy, but of course we were sympathetic with Israel, but just because we were identified as Jews. So there were riots, Jewish businesses had been burnt down, Jews who had been walking possibly in the streets or being in the wrong place had been killed. And they burnt my father's warehouse, and the mob came and surrounded my family home and put gasoline all around it and tried to burn it down. So my Muslim neighbor who lived on the top floor came down and convinced the mob that the Jewish family didn't live there anymore. And actually, by doing that, he saved my family's life. So I'm very grateful to this righteous Muslim who stood up against evil. In the meantime, my parents had to warn me not to come home, because the mob not only, they left, but they actually left a man guarding the building to make sure that the Jewish family wouldn't come home. So I got a phone call at work. I was working for a British engineering company at the time, that I had to do whatever it took, but I couldn't come home because I would, I would expose my parents hiding. So I went home with my boss, a man by the name of Brian, and he hid me in his garage. I thought it would be like 2 or 3 days, but it took about a month before I actually I went back to my house. And it was at that time that the Libyan government decreed that all Jews who wanted to leave could do so only if they left all their assets and all of their homes and everything they owned behind. And we were allowed to leave the country with one suitcase at $20 with us, just the equivalent of $20. Eventually I rejoined my family, and we were being driven to the airport by a local bus that had only a driver and a conductor in it, and just the 7 members of my family. As the bus was driving, it stopped in the middle of a road, and at that point the driver went outside and started pulling some sort of a lever, and I came up to the conductor and I begged him to get us to the airport, and I tried to convince him that maybe I could give him a certain amount of money and he would get us to the airport safely. But he pushed me away and called me all kinds of names, you filthy Jew, and names that I would not repeat today. However, and then he kept saying, "You're killing my brothers in Palestine, you're killing my brothers in Palestine." So that's when I realized that something serious was about to happen to my family. So I waited for the conductor to leave the bus, and I just followed him, and at a distance, of course. And eventually I found a phone booth by going into a little cabin and asking to use the phone. And when I walked in there, I found the conductor that was calling me all kinds of names, and he was using the phone. So when I asked him, because he wouldn't let me use it, and I struggled with him physically, I was, of course, very scared, and I was only 19 years old at the time. And I dialed the number of Brian, the British engineer who hid me in his home. And I told him in English to come and rescue us, and told him the location. So it was at that time that I turned around and realized that the door was now being blocked by 3 men that were stopping me from leaving this tiny little booth where I made the phone call. So I pushed my way out, and I started running back to the bus as fast as I could. And I found that the driver of the bus was holding a packet of matches in his hands, and when I looked down, there was a huge pool of gasoline right under the bus. So it was only at that moment that I truly understood the danger we were in, and that realized that actually the bus was going to be blown up. So I tried not to panic, and I started following the driver, and wherever he went with the packet of matches. And a few minutes later, Brian and another colleague of his came with 2 jeeps. They unloaded us from the bus and took out whatever few things we had with us. And both of them were mechanical engineers, and the minute they looked at what was happening, they said, "We have to get you out of here. This bus is ready to blow up." And they drove us back to the airport. By the time we arrived at the airport, the people who check you in to check your luggage, they looked at our travel documents and they said, "Bublil family, you're not supposed to be here," which of course confirmed everything, that this was supposed to be an organized plot to get rid of us. We were stripped, we were harassed, we were spat out. They decided not to take our luggage onto the plane. We had to take our own things on, and eventually we made it we flew out of Libya, and the only place we could really go where we could find seats to a country that was not an Arab country was the island of Malta. And that's where we wound up. And eventually we made our way to Italy. We lived in Rome for 2 years. My sister and I, well, we were 7 of us in the family, and we really struggled because there was no money anymore. We had been used to somewhat of an economically comfortable home. We now had nothing. So all of us lived in a very small studio apartment, and the 7 of us had to sleep on the floor. But because there was no room left on the floor, my sister and I slept in the bathtub for 2 years because there was just no place to sleep. Eventually I decided in 1969, I decided to emigrate to the United States, and I came as a refugee with an organization called HIAS, which is a Hebrew society for immigration, Hebrew Immigration Society, and I'm very grateful for that. But again, I came by myself. I was just 21 years old, and I came with a big trunk and $400 in my pocket, which was all my savings, and I was able to make a new life for myself.
Can you tell me about JIMENA?
The Jews of the Middle East and North Africa and the Gulf region have had a presence in some areas for as many as 3,000 years. For example, the Jews of Babylonia had been there since Babylonian times. The Jewish community of Libya dates back over 2,000 years. So the idea that, you know, Jews, the idea why JIMENA came about is also to show that we were in the region many years, actually hundreds of years, before the Arab conquest of the 7th century. And so it's incorrect to think that the Jews of North Africa happen to be coming with the colonization of those countries or anything like that. We had been indigenous to the regions for over 2,000 years.
So what is JIMENA doing?
JIMENA's mission is to not only educate the public about the history, but to put this history in its rightful place. The history narrative, especially the modern day narrative in the last 60 years, which includes, of course, since the formation of the State of Israel to today, in the last 60 years, has really hardly been recorded. And what's really important is that people need to recognize that the Middle Eastern conflict left 2 groups of refugees, the Palestinians and the Jews. When the Arab leaders encouraged the Palestinians to leave their homes, or whether the Palestinians escaped from their homes because they were afraid, or whatever the reason is, they were made refugees, and that issue needs to be obviously addressed because we have today a large number of Palestinian refugees that have not been resettled. On the other hand, the same leaders who did that had not accepted the United Nations resolution, which was in 1948, to have a Palestinian state next to Israel. So these leaders, by not accepting Israel as a state and waging war against Israel, created thousands and thousands of Palestinian refugees. Every war creates refugees. That's nothing that is new. On the other hand, the same leaders who didn't accept the creation of the State of Israel waged a different sort of war against their own Jewish populations. And when they did that, and by expelling them and having a huge exodus from the Arab countries, they actually created not just the Palestinian refugee issue, but the Jewish refugee issue. So we really need to look at this and at the history and the facts and shift the blame to where it really belongs, which is to the Arab leaders who sinned not only once but twice. First, by declaring war against Israel rather than accepting the state of Israel as a state and living side by side, therefore creating the Palestinian refugee issue, and harassing and killing and burning and confiscating the Jewish properties of their own Jewish indigenous populations until those people, all of us, left. And there, from close to 1 million Jews that lived in those Arab countries, we only have 5,000, a little bit over 5,000 left today, mostly in Morocco, and 1,000 or so in Tunisia.
Can you tell the story about the school lesson, that school lesson?
I had my first experience of hate education when I was 6 years old, because my mother took me to a local madrasa school, and we just wanted to watch what the teacher came in to the classroom, and she was teaching 6-year-old little girls, Muslim girls, and she turned to the blackboard and she said, if you have 10 Jews, you kill 5 of them. How many Jews do you have left to kill? That was the first arithmetic lesson that these girls were going to have. So I became very scared at the time. I was very young, and I came up crying to my mom, and I said, does that mean they're going to kill us? Because this is actually my first experience of fear, and besides, I was afraid that my next door neighbors or the little girls that I was playing with in my neighborhood might kill me, because after seeing that lesson, it's obviously that was the reason why my parents sent me to Catholic school, because I wasn't about to go to that school.
Did you have Jewish girlfriends growing up?
Yes, we had mostly it was my cousins. I had a lot of cousins. They were the daughters of my father's sisters, and we had a large family. So most of my friends were my cousins. But I did have a couple of Arab friends that were my Arab neighbors, and we became very close friends and played together a lot. But by the time I was 13 or 14, they were married off to somebody.
So you understood at a young age that as a Jewish woman you didn't have a future in Libya, that you needed to leave, you wanted to go to...
I came to that realization only after I went to school abroad. I realized that I was missing an incredible opportunity of freedom, that I could walk around whether I was in Lausanne, Geneva, or Rome with a Star of David, and I would not be afraid that someone would, harass me or hit me or call me dirty Jew. And I also saw generally the freedom, not only of the people that were living as Jews in Western countries, but also a freedom as a woman. This was a freedom that was not part of our lifestyle. Women were pretty much, maybe, definitely, certainly not treated as they were in Muslim society. We were much more westernized, but nonetheless, there were still mixed marriages, arranged marriages, and dowry was involved. The higher, more money you had, the better the catch, as far as, and so forth. And after I went to Switzerland, I realized that I did not want to be part of that, of that piece of the culture. I loved my culture, I loved my traditions, I loved my family and my community, but I did not want to participate in this ongoing tradition.
What did you love about the culture of being a Jewish Libyan person?
I loved the cuisine. I loved some of the traditional, whether they were religious festivities or, anything to do with the customs, the costumes, the the traditions, the food. Certainly, food played a very big part in the life, everyday life of Jewish people in Libya. In fact, some of the cuisine, I love to cook special dishes that are traditional. For example, Friday night. What you may cook on a Friday night, whether it's a haraimi dish or couscous with the mafroum, which is the traditional dish for Friday night, may not necessarily be the dish you would be cooking for the rest of the week, because for Shabbat it was very special to do these particular dishes. So when I get to this day, and I'm much older woman by now, I still, every time that I feel, a certain nostalgia about my background, I would either put rose water in my coffee, which is very traditional, or I would make a dish such as haraimi or something like that. There were customs such as henna ceremony, which again JIMENA is reviving, and we're having a lot of success with it. It takes place about a week before the wedding, 5 days to a week before the wedding, and typically the bride is dressed with very traditional, very colorful costumes, and Arabic Jewish music is played at the party, and the women in this particular traditional of henna are very much in charge. This is one area where it's pretty much a woman's party. Although now, of course, in Israel they celebrate it, and of course all the men get to come. But when I grew up, it was only for women, and all the women would be sitting, if they were married, they would be sitting there giggling about the first night of their wedding and giving advice to the bride and so forth. And most of us would get up and start dancing around the bride to be and so forth. So I do miss those traditions and certainly those customs.
What were the assets that your family left behind in Libya?
We had to leave all of our assets behind. That was one of the conditions that the government made when we left, and they let us go with. It was a one-way exit visa. We had to leave our home, which was a beautiful house with everything in it, and that, of course, we had to leave all of our assets, our bank accounts, all of the property that my father had accumulated as a builder. He was in the real estate, so all of that had been confiscated.
In community assets, like
as far as our family, of course, was part of a community, so there were, of course, community assets that also were left behind: synagogues, mikvahs, any ritual place, that cemeteries. In fact, today the cemetery where my ancestors were buried is now the site of the first big first-class hotel in Tripoli. It was built over the graves of these Jewish people. First it was desecrated multiple times by the population, and then eventually they built a big hotel over there. So, sometimes when people would ask me, would you go back to Tripoli? Would you go back to Libya? After all, there has been efforts by Muammar Gaddafi to quote-unquote invite its Jewish population back. I answer with another question, which is, if you were escaping from Nazi Germany and came to this country and the same man, Hitler, was in charge of Germany, would you go back? Of course the answer is no, because as we are looking at it today, when we look at the media and communications and universities and everywhere in their countries, the anti-Semitism has actually increased. There are no Jews left in Egypt, and there are no Jews left in hardly any of their countries, and yet we have much more anti-Semitism today than 1967. So we know that you cannot go back to an environment where this anti-Jewish hatred keeps perpetrating.
Do you have a message, a general message to give to the people in Libya now?
I believe that in order for the Libyan people themselves to reconcile with this history, is to look at the wrongs that were done to their own Jewish people. We were part of the society. We were part of the country. We had been there for 2,000 years, even before the Arab Muslims came to occupy. And yet, the wrongs that were done to us need to be looked at in order for us to have some sort of reconciliation. Because unless you have a reconciliation, you cannot really, heal from this experience. I know that the people themselves may not have wanted to do that to us had they been raised in an environment of tolerance. And we know that the intolerance against Jews is taking place not just in Libya but in many other Arab countries, and we know the culture of hatred and washing children in hating Jews and hating Israelis is only going to bring more suicide bombers, and is going to only make it harder for us to achieve peace in the Middle East. But what I would like to challenge the Arabs in general, whether they're Libyans or any person that lives today as a Muslim in the Arab country, is to challenge them to look at one issue, which is the way that the Jewish populations that were made penniless refugees and became refugees overnight with nothing but the clothes on their backs, how we have been absorbed so successfully, not just by Israel, that took 600,000 Jews and integrated them very successfully, and not with a single penny from the United Nations, but also we were integrated into the countries that took us in, that hosted us, whether it's Canada or United States or France. On the other hand, the Arabs need to take a deep look at what they have done to their own Palestinians. If you take an example such as Lebanon, where 250,000 plus refugees, Palestinian refugees, reside in Lebanon, you'll find that they have not been given nationality, they have not been integrated, they're not allowed to have a full-time job, and they're not given all the rights that Lebanese citizens have. This is after 60 years. Some of them have been living there as long as 50 to 60 years. So the fact is that when a Palestinian Arab goes to live in France, Canada, New Zealand, or United States, they become an integral part of that society. They're given full rights, and their children don't go back to become suicide bombers. So what that tells us is that the same Arab leaders to this day, some 50 plus years later, they're refusing to integrate their own brothers and sisters. And that is what we really need to look at, is that so long as these people, these leaders refuse to integrate their brothers and sisters within their own North African countries, or even for that matter Saudi Arabia just passed the law a couple of years ago allowing for other Muslims to become citizens of that country, except for one group, which is the Palestinians. So again, if they are being discriminated in this fashion and refuse the right to be integrated, we will still have refugee camps, and we will still have a common enemy. The Arabs will have a common enemy and a cause célèbre to rally their own Arabs against Israel. So I encourage for the Arab leaders themselves and the populations of those countries to really look into this and see the wrongs that are being done to the Palestinians by their own Arab leaders. silver threads are woven through the fabric, and it's all hand woven. This is the dad, which is the traditional dress that my grandmother wore for her wedding, and my mother wore for hers, and I wore for mine for the henna ceremony. The hand of Fatima, which chases the evil eye.
Oh, let me see. Oh, okay, I see. It's so shiny, it's like you can barely notice it, but if you get close, you can see it chase the evil eye.
This is the typical identity paper that was given to Jewish citizens because they were considered non-citizens and therefore did not have a passport, but they did have what they call a travel document. This is an authentic one that was issued by the Libyan government to one of our family members.
Okay, is there anything inside that you want to show us as well, or just
Well, we could probably show.
It's okay to show, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, flip the pages.
This shows an entry visa, 1967, from Libya into Rome.
Okay, that's good. So this is from the Italian government?
This is from the Italian police station saying that we have a permit to stay in Italy because we came in as refugees. This photo was taken at the Scuola Roma. It's the elementary school where most of the Jewish girls went, and it was a Jewish holiday of Purim where all the Jewish carnival, where a lot of the Jewish girls got dressed up in costumes. I was about 10 years old at the time. I am here in a photograph with human rights activist from the Soviet Union and Nobel Peace Prize winner Andrei Sakharov and his wife Elena Bonner and my husband and myself. That's at the time that I was working to help Russian dissidents and Jewish dissidents from Russia.